And good morning. Hello, my name is Dennis Dean, and I have the pleasure of leading Veritas Global Strategic Alliances during my day job. And today I have the distinct honor of being the guest host for our latest episode of Veritas Live. So we've got a great show planned today. I'm super excited. We have the topic is 2022 hottest market for cyber criminals, which is really focused around the global supply chain disruption, just like we needed some more of that. So before we get started with our guest speakers and a lot of the exciting content, I did want to recognize our dear friend and colleague, Antti Cusumano, the previous host of the Veritas Live show, who has found himself an excellent new adventure. Anthony, from everyone here at the show, we wish you a wonderful fair winds and following seas, because we know anywhere where you go, we're going to be able to recognize you with your Hawaiian shirts. I probably need to think about getting myself one. But Anthony, you'll be missed. Thank you for your energy and passion, and all the best of luck to you. In all seriousness, Anthony's done a great job. He really set the bar high, and we'll do our very best to keep up. So today's show is being live streamed on YouTube and LinkedIn, and we would love to hear from everybody who's out there. We are super interested to get your comments and questions in regards to the content, and also if you have any feedback for us, that's always interesting to know too. So my first question to the audience out there is, where are you watching from? Hit it up in the comments, use the hashtag for Veritas Live. Let us know where you're sitting in the world today, where you're watching the show from. It's always good to hear from the folks out there in the field. Now, let me jump in and move into our really exciting speaker lineup today. So today we have Veritas's very own Ian Wood, who is our head of technology in UK and Ireland. And thank you for coming, Ian. We also have a very important speaker, our special guest today, which is Craig Martin, who is part of the faculty at Santa Clara University. He's also the former senior vice president of global operations over at FireEye, which was at the time was Mandiant Consulting, was part of FireEye. They've now gone through a different evolution and become Trellix. But Craig brings a wealth of knowledge, both past and present, to the show. And we're super excited to have him here as a true supply chain expert. Craig, good morning and welcome to you as well.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
There we go. So let's get cracking. So Ian, where are you located today?
I am just in Reading in the UK, which is about 40 miles west of London.
Okay, good to hear. The accent sounds a little out of place, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Craig, how about yourself? Where are you dialing in from today?
Man, beautiful downtown Los Gatos here in the Bay Area.
There we go. Sunny Bay Area can't be beat. All righty. So before we get into it, now that we have, Craig and Ian, I have to ask you, give us a little bit of an icebreaker here. Why don't you share with the audience maybe an example of one of the biggest cyber attacks that you're aware of in your past, in your history, and what the context was of that. So I'm just going to start with you, Craig.
Got to come up with just one, huh?
Just the one for now. We might get into some others later.
Okay. I think I'll probably take the SolarWinds breach, which took place in 2020, just because it demonstrates the benefit and the leverage that a supply chain attack can bring to a threat actor. Basically, this was a case where it appeared to be driven by Russian state-sponsored hackers that were able to penetrate the software development process within SolarWinds Orion software, and somehow were able to avoid detection during the whole software QA process, made it into SolarWinds website for download by customers, of which customers are instructed to do. Go ahead and load that latest release so that you can get the latest security patches in place and things like that. So everybody did that good hygiene thing. And it turned out that 18,000 customers had downloaded it with malicious code rather than the good clean code that SolarWinds intended. And so with that, it wasn't until FireEye actually detected it, because they themselves had been breached with their very sophisticated tools, that was even discovered. So that's just an example where the supply chain leverage of a one-to-many kind of an opportunity is really huge. The number of targets within that whole 18,000 was maybe just 10 or so, and it likely was the US government, but then there was collateral damage with the other private companies that were involved as well.
Yeah, no, that SolarWinds breach, I think everyone pretty much heard about that one. And just a word to the wise in terms of detection abilities there. Good example, Craig. Thank you for sharing.
Yep.
Ian, let me toss it to you. What example can you think of?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to go back in time, actually. I'm going to go 10 years ago with what I see as one of the first big public supply chain attacks out in the Middle East. And this was pretty destructive. It was around 2012. It was arguably political motives that took out a significant amount of OT infrastructure in a large oil and gas organization. And it was quite memorable for me because it was the very first time that such an event is so public that we noticed, and it was so destructive. So this was a malware that had entered through a phishing, typically what was then 10 years ago an evolving landscape of sophisticated phishing attacks, delivered as a payload into their business network, and then quickly traversed through their organization to affect 30,000 Windows-based systems, from desktops to operating systems that are managing the supply chain of oil and gas, and very, very destructive. It was also quite interesting is that there were some new attributes emerging. Once the attackers are in, and once they have full access, they can get up to no good. And in this instance, they entered the network, they destroyed arguably a large amount of infrastructure, which was fairly damaging. But equally, they gathered a lot of intel and made that public knowledge. They gathered very sensitive login information of their C-level. They published that. They did a schematic of the organization's security hardware and software. Again, they published all of that. And ultimately, they wanted to notoriety in all essence, because they were fairly adamant to get some public acknowledgement from the said organization that they'd experienced downtime. A long story short, somewhat 10 to 12 days, a lot of effort, a lot of expense in recovering those 30,000 workstations and operating systems in the supply chain to come up and running again. And so I think that was quite noticeable for me, or notable for me, because it was one of the first.
Definitely. Yeah, look, it's hard not to have some morbid fascination with those type of attacks. I think that, a couple of commonalities there, entry points, vulnerabilities within the actual production infrastructure, and then of course the significant impact of not just to production, but actually, as you said, publishing confidential data. All right, so let's dig into that a little bit. Craig, I'm going to come to you. So when you take a look at a macro perspective of the current state of the supply chain challenges, and especially with cyber threats being on the rise in 2022, but as a gradual evolution, can you give us a sense about what your perspective is in terms of where we are today in the world with the supply chain vulnerabilities?
Sure. So I guess you have to maybe go back 15, 20 years or 30 years or so and kind of look at the environment that we were in at the time and how it's evolved very, very quickly, and the impact that that's had in terms of supply chain vulnerabilities. So it wasn't that long ago that it was pretty common that companies had their own manufacturing, their own factories, and they would manage things themselves. And then the supply base was fairly contained, mostly domestic companies and maybe some well-known international companies, et cetera. So the world was fairly contained in that regard. Then when you add the advent of the internet and then search engines on top of that, before you know it, you can start to do a search and find suppliers somewhere in the world that provide some kind of a service or a potential performance advantage or a cost advantage or whatever. So it's very enticing, especially to an operations executive that's always trying to drive lower cost and faster performance, to try and take advantage of those. So before you know it, your supply chain nodes start to get broader and broader. And then all of a sudden, those supply chain nodes are not just connected directly to you, but to each other, because they're passing your IP back and forth between, a design house and maybe the proto company, whatever. And so very, very quickly, the network expands quite a bit. And then when you add on top of that, the emergence of IoT devices, which are everywhere now and in every form and fashion of firmware, and from toasters to sensors and cameras and things like that. You have the potential for a lot of entry points for attackers to attack. On top of that, the good news is that corporations like Veritas and many large companies have done a pretty good job of corralling the putting defenses around their own environment. But that means that it's very easy to go through a side door. That's another attractive way to do it, through a supply chain partner. So all of those things combined, I think, have made it, combined with the one-to-many that I mentioned, have made it an environment that's very easy and very rich for attackers to go after.
Okay, so I liked everything you said apart from the very easy bit. And I guess I'm going to go to Ian there. So it sounds like we have a plethora now of entry points, much more complicated infrastructure. We've given IP addresses to pretty much everything. I think you said coasters in your IoT example, right? So let me come to you, Ian. Ian, when you take a look at, some of the industry standards that are out there, there's quite a few of them. You look at maybe what we can be doing. What does best practice look like in terms of trying to protect against some of the challenges that Craig has laid out?
Yeah, it's a good question. And when Craig was describing this, I kind of thought of it's an evolving game of cat and mouse between the bad actors and all of those that are protecting the key critical infrastructures. And so there have been quite a bit of involvement around those industry standards. I take things like the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They've got some good frameworks around cyber resiliency. There's been a lot of work, at least where I live in the UK, things like the National Cyber Security Centre in the UK published a lot of white papers, a lot of guidance to individuals to stay safer, protect critical assets a lot better with all those interdependent connections. I think ultimately the standards are only as good as those following them. So that's really important for any organization to look at those standards and adhere to them. The other thing I think that's evolved with those standards, in the early days, it was all about keeping the bad actors out. And that's important. And we got to continue to do that. But from my perspective and where I work, I think there's an acknowledgement from those standards, from those frameworks, that there's no such a thing as 100% protection. So actually ensuring that once you've identified that something's gone wrong, you've detected that, you're able to respond and recover. So I think that a lot of the frameworks I've seen have added in the recovery aspects. How do I bring myself back to a known state? I think of the word resilience, which the definition is in essence to bounce back. And I think that's where a lot of I've seen those frameworks evolve to acknowledging there's no such a thing as 100% protection, but making sure organizations, supply chains have tested, have responded, and in essence can recover from what unfortunately seems an eventuality of being attacked.
If I could add to that, I mean, I think to what Ian's saying is that, if you take the posture that the assumption is you're going to be attacked, then your headset is focused on prevention and remediation and things like that. So, it puts you in a better position in case you are attacked. So at least as we used to view it at FireEye, to take the assumption that you're going to be breached and then put defenses around those and looking at all the different elements that you need to protect. And then you start to figure out where are reduce the potential for being breached by making certain, maybe even business strategic decisions that might limit your exposure in certain areas. And as an example, do I want to put a custom chip into my product, or do I want to use an industry standard chip? A custom chip means that potentially a threat actor could go way down in the supply chain and maliciously compromise the code at that level, whereas a standard chip, you can't target that company until later in the process and the manufacturing, et cetera. So that's one example. And then secondly, you want to make sure that if you are breached, that the impact of a breach is contained as much as possible in terms of compartmentalizing and simplifying the environment, and to your point, Ian, quick remediation and recovery. Sort of the playbook that we had talked about.
So it sounds about very common elements there. I think that rather than expecting to be secure all the time, it really comes down to adapting to this evolving challenge, right? Limiting the damage, making sure that you can respond, hopefully at a moment's notice. So I want to stay with you, Craig, for a little bit now. I mean, we obviously there's no silver bullet. I mean, that was my conclusion based on what both you and Ian said, which is a shame. But what does good look like here? How do we really make sure that we help stop these future attacks? How do we make sure that we're set up, our customers, our partners, all of the end users out there? How can we make sure that we actually prevent the damage that these bad actors can do to our networks and our production infrastructure?
Well, there's a lot to it. The thing that we try and do is figure out a way to take an all-encompassing look at the environment that you're looking at. One of the key attributes of most breaches is there's some human element involved. And so the hiring practice for not just the company yourself, but for your subcontractors and your suppliers to make sure that the hiring practices, the background checks, the training, the physical access controls, the security access controls, all those kinds of things are contained, based on a need to know, and that that the employees that are working on your products and your systems are legit and are going through continuous training and things like that. And then in the case of hardware products, or any type of service, you want to make sure that the vendors that you're considering to use are vetted in a very systematic way, looking at all the different elements of potential exposure from a security point of view. The one thing that becomes clear is that the supply chain, historically you think of it parts flowing through a manufacturing process, but really when you think about it, it's the janitor that has access to the side doors. It's the legal support that might be a third party that's got your intellectual property that you're working through, contracts or whatever. There's all kinds of things that are broader than just the traditional flow that they come into play. So it's an all-encompassing look that I think really, again, getting back to that, assuming that you're going to be breached, what are the different areas where you could have exposure, and then just going after each one of those. Well, one example, if I was just reading about Dell Technologies, they've got a supply chain security white paper on their website. And when you read through it, just the amount of the number of topics and the amount of diligence and the amount of protection that's required to do that. Again, as Ian said, looking at some of the industry standards that are being developed through NIST or CTPAT for moving products and things like that. There's a lot of work out there, and a lot of good work, but there's an awful lot of things that need to get addressed. And so that's really where the challenge is. And the whole thing about a supply chain, it's the classic weakest link thing. So you can do everything right except one, and that's all that matters. And you can find yourself exposed.
Yeah, definitely. So, when I think about, the magnitude of the task and the challenge, Ian, let me come back to you. In terms of where to start, what is the balance between, I think reactiveness versus proactiveness? What are some of the key areas to begin looking how to protect the infrastructure to make sure that there is an identification process in place, the ability to recover? Can you give us a sense of, how you would approach a typical either enterprise client or very large multinational company?
Yeah, that's a good question. In essence, I think visibility is key. I think most can probably put their hands up and say that in reality, they work with a lot of unknowns and a lack of visibility in their environment. So I always think shine a light on all of your key interconnected aspects. If I look at IT, all of those IT systems that are interconnected, I think as Craig mentioned, those interconnections now in a distributed supply chain can exist in relationships with other suppliers. But once you start with visibility and you understand all the interconnected aspects of your organization, then it's around protecting those the best you can. And then at the end, where I think I've been involved a lot is, the Scout motto is be prepared. My motto is prepare for the worst. And it sounds pretty bleak, but in that proactive preparedness, I think it's all about making sure, firstly, you understand, as I mentioned earlier, those interconnected systems. Secondly, understanding, I'd use the word acceptable time to recover. Think of the worst, you've been breached, damage has been done. What's the acceptable time to that infrastructure that it'll take to bring you back to a known state? And once you know that, then design your resiliency, your protection, and your recovery systems around what that acceptable time is to recover. And in my experience, that's, we get involved with a lot of organizations, unfortunately, that have been breached, and they turn to Veritas to recover their estate. And in most instances, it's that lack of really understanding how long the business will accept to have those systems out that is the biggest moment. And that's what causes them the most pain. So once you know that, once you design your system around protecting and recovery, my final thing there is test. I'll probably say test, and then test again. Because the more you can be prepared for the worst, the better off you're going to be in the unfortunate event that something has got through.
And I appreciate that. So there's a big spectrum of activities here that need to be covered off. Craig, I'd like you to pile on here with what Ian said. I mean, we think about, identification, we think about protecting, we think about testing. I mean, across that spectrum, what are your observations here out there in the field? What are you seeing and hearing right now? Are customers learning? Are they becoming smarter at it? Are we as the, how do I say this, the sort of ecosystem of vendors who are attacking this threat? How is that working together? What are your observations on the trends there?
Well, the trends are in many ways positive. I was just looking at Mandiant sends out their annual report of they call it M trends, which are just chronicling all of the different activities that they track during the course of the year. And when you go back about 10 years, the average latency of time that a breach had taken place within a network from the time that the breach took place until the time it was detected was like a staggering 419 days back in like 2010. That has come down continuously, and I think this past year was like 22 days on average. But there's still 22 days where a threat actor can wreak havoc within your environment when you do that. Some of that is because, as I said, the perimeter defenses around companies are doing much better in that regard. There's a lot more sophistication on the defensive side, and it's also in part due to the fact that the trend in ransomware is such that a ransomware attack doesn't really want to sit latent within a system. You want to get in the system and get your cache and move on to the next one. So the latency of an attack to a known from breach to known attack is a very short period of time. So that's sort of skewing it a little bit. But there's certainly a lot of work that's being done on that. The trick is I saw one study a couple of years ago about Ponemon Institute, I think, did a survey that something like 300 and something like that different agencies typically have access to the intellectual property within your company at one level or another. But it also cited that something like 35% of the companies that were surveyed didn't even have a list of who those suppliers were. So again, the awareness topic of, knowing where your exposures are and making sure that you've got a process to track it and a champion within the company and things like that. Also executive level involvement to make sure that you're getting the right kind of support and the right kind of attention to the areas where there's exposure is certainly key. So it's getting better in that regard. But on the other hand, as Ian said, cat and mouse, the amount of sophistication from the threat actors and nation state backed ventures and things like that are, pretty daunting.
Yeah. Well, I think, the silver lining here is we're going to be kept busy for the next few years is what it sounds like. I certainly appreciate the perspectives that, you, Craig, and Ian are bringing to the table here. I trust our audience has been listening carefully, and we're going to be better for it. I think, at this time, I'd like to thank Ian and Craig for your time. I mean, this is super exciting to me. I think that as we get better and deeper into the trends, as our tools get better, as our customers get more savvy, this is going to be one to watch over the next few years. I don't think it's going away in a hurry. And to your first example, Ian, it started over a decade ago. So we can expect to see a higher level of sophistication. So with that said, I'd like to thank you both very, very much for sharing today and for being part of the show. Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
We're all in this together, so thank you very much for the opportunity.
You bet. So to the audience out there, if you'd like to connect with our guests, you can definitely find them both on LinkedIn. So Ian and Craig are available for you to reach out to. I would also like to share that if you want to learn a little bit more about cyber risk in the supply chain, Craig has actually written a chapter on this in a book called Smart Manufacturing, the Lean Six Sigma Way. You can find that on wiley.com. And for those of you in the Bay Area, he may even sign the book for you if you get down and meet him in person. So that could be something exciting as well. Do you want to plug in for the next show? Coming up on May 24th will be our next episode of Veritas Live. And for that, we've got Johnny King, who will be the host, leading a discussion on another key trending topic that was very dear to our hearts, specifically sustainability and technology. So again, another key trend that we are observing in the market. And I very much hope that all of you out there will join us again. With that said, it's been a real pleasure to host this show. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day or evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. I've seen that we've got an audience from around the world. Thank you very much and have a wonderful week. Goodbye from us here at Veritas Live.
Thank you.